Sorry, Chuck Broin, my apologies.
Okay, don't worry. Minister, thanks very much for the outline of the bill. Look, as you know, Sinn Féin opposed the rent pressure zones when they were introduced back in 2016. We did so at the time because we felt a 12.5% rent increase over 3 years for tenants who were already paying rents that were far too high was simply unsustainable. But we also argued that the RPZ would create perverse incentives for landlords outside the rent pressure zones to jack up rents even higher than those levels. We warned at the time, specifically during the debate, that it would create a two-tier rental market with long-term secure tenants subject to compliant landlords, but new tenancies and new tenants into the market having to pay much higher prices. And we did also warn that there were too many loopholes. In fact, substantial renovations and the lack of any statutory definition was a significant issue that many of us raised during the course of the debate. And I have to say, on all of those issues, I think we were proven right. We know from the RTB quarterly index that the cap has been regularly breached. We can see very clearly, particularly from the last quarterly index from the RTB, that that two-tier market between long-term secure tenants and new entrants to the market is very much in evidence. And we know that the loopholes, particularly the substantial change, is being actively breached in the form of regular rent evictions. So in some senses, the changes in this bill, which I'm going to welcome and talk to in a second, are a kind of admission of failure. And a failure in particular to listen to what many on the opposition benches warned and in fact proposed useful amendments back in 2016, which if we had been listened to then by your predecessor, some of the issues that you're now thankfully addressing today wouldn't have been necessary. And I don't say that in any way to gloat, but really to urge you to listen carefully to what all of the opposition deputies are going to say in terms of potential constructive amendment to this bill so that we can try and enhance it over the number of coming weeks. As you know, our preference back in 2016 was rent certainty. You know we're strong advocates of a rent freeze as an emergency measure now, but given the fact that rent pressure zones are what's on the table, we're going to engage constructively with this bill in the spirit in which it has been presented, so that, notwithstanding our criticisms of the overall system, we try and at least make sure it works in the very best interests of tenants as well as landlords. And on that basis, I have to say I welcome, and you know this is Sinn Féin's position, I welcome the main provisions. I strongly welcome increased protections for tenants and powers for the Residential Tenancies Board, but I would urge you to listen to us on the opposition when we say there are a number of significant weaknesses in this bill, which I think, with sensible amendment at committee stage, can be addressed and making it a much better instrument for everybody. I want to echo Deputy O'Brien and express some disappointment with the delay in the bill. However, I suspect privately you've also been disappointed in the delay. I don't think the delay is your responsibility or that of the officials in your department, but I still want to put that on record. And like Deputy O'Brien, I give a clear commitment. We will progress this bill through the House as quickly as possible, Minister. And we will do that in the spirit which you have asked us to do. But we won't allow the speed of progress to in any way undermine our responsibility to scrutinise this legislation. The Residential Tenancies Acts have become a very, very complex web of legislation. You know that far better than I. And I think it's incumbent on us, particularly at committee, to spend the requisite amount of time to ensure that this latest range of amendments don't unduly complicate that already complex set of rules and regulations. And I think we can do both of those if we work in that spirit of cooperation. Just in terms of the detail of the bill, first of all, I do want to welcome the legal definition of substantial change. It's quite a technical definition, and I would hope at committee stage we can tease out maybe some of the rationale for those definitions so that we can get into the substance of that. But I always felt a legal definition was required, and I want to welcome the fact that it's here. I want to welcome the very sensible proposal simply to roll over Part 4 tenancies when they expire so that it's not a new tenancy but simply an extension of the existing Part 4 tenancy, something that should have always been in the original legislation and would be very welcomed here. I want to welcome strongly the extended notice to quit periods. And I'd like you to consider two suggestions. One is a small addition to the minimum notice to quit period of 28 days. All of the notice to quit periods immediately above that have increased somewhat. And even to give it an extra 7 days to the 35, I just think, given what's going on in the rental market, some extra little bit of comfort there for tenants would be welcome. I do think, however, if the intention of this amendment is to and somehow deal with the large number of family presentations into homeless services because of vacant possession notices to quit. I don't think it is going to fix that problem. And again, the Minister knows my position. I would urge you to consider some form of the Focus Ireland amendment, whether by way of a government amendment to this bill or in your next round of legislation, to try and deal with that particular issue, because otherwise, while we might be giving families at risk of homelessness a little bit extra time, ultimately, if we can't keep them in those properties, they will still end up presenting as homelessness. So that doesn't detract from the fact that I think this is welcome. But if it is intended to tackle that particular problem, I don't think it will, and therefore I'd urge you to consider additional action. I welcome the publication of determinations. Many of us benefit from those. But I have one concern which I would like you to either address when you come back to committee or consider. I don't think it's necessary for the names of tenants and landlords to be published when those determinations go live. The value of the determinations is for us to have that record, and other people taking cases to have the detail of those determinations. And I do think, both for the privacy of tenants and landlords, as well as, I suppose, for their own protection and reputation, there should be some consideration of the redaction of the names of landlords and tenants when the full determinations are published. My understanding is that happens currently in Workplace Relations Commission cases. I could be wrong, and maybe the Minister could check that. But I do think that might be something, though small, is worth considering. I'm not clear at all as to why there's a proposition to charge for mediation. The whole point of mediation is to try and encourage an agreement between landlords and tenants so that we don't have to go through adjudication and possibly an appeal to a tribunal. So if we make it an expense, particularly for low-income tenants, or indeed some landlords who may be in financial difficulties with mortgage arrears, etc., then it's less likely to work. And therefore, I'm not sure of the rationale, and again, I would urge the Minister to reconsider that. I understand the logic in terms of the resetting of invalid notices, and I'm not against that in principle. I just asked the Minister either to come back at committee with an explanation as to why it's just 28 days as opposed to maybe something a little bit longer. I think that's something we just need to tease out. I'm not opposed to it, but I do think some consideration needs to be given. Contrary to Deputy Scanlon, I actually think the annual registration is essential. The policing powers of the Residential Tenancies Board with respect to the RPZs can only work if they have access to accurate data. We know ourselves the limitations of the RTB's quarterly rent index because it only includes new tenancies or re-registered tenancies. So having that annual data makes absolute sense and in a sense underpins a lot of the good powers that have been given. I think the fee is moderate. I welcome the fact that the approved housing body sector will pay a lower fee. I don't understand why you've changed the penalty mechanism that's currently in place, however. So having a simple, flat-based penalty disincentivises somebody who's breaking the rules from changing their mind. The current system, where there's an incremental increase in the penalty, in some senses incentivises landlords who have been notified of the breach to get their house in order much more quickly. And again, I would just urge you to maybe relook at that. And if there's some good reasons why you've chosen to move away from that, do come back to us at committee and talk us through it in more detail. The real substance of the bill, as we know, and the real innovation is Part 7A, which is the new sanctions regime. And again, all of the comments I'm going to make, Minister, are in the context of supporting much of what you're trying to do here and trying to ensure that it is an effective mechanism. Sanctioning or having powers to sanction landlords who are in clear breach of the RPZs only works if landlords fear the sanctions will be used and used in a speedy manner to disincentivise breaches. And a sanction regime is also very good for the compliant landlords. For the landlord who is out doing their job right, who is staying within the law, it's really quite galling for those landlords who are in breach of the rent pressure zones to be able to do that. And therefore, this isn't just a measure which is protecting tenants. It's also a measure which is protecting compliant landlords, ensuring they're not being undercut by those in breach of the regulations. I absolutely welcome the powers of the Residential Tenancies Board both to initiate and to conduct the investigations. This is really, really important, and the provisions, I think, are well outlined in the bill. I do think it's a pity that these powers are only applicable to breaches of the rent pressure zones and non-registration. And I would urge the Minister to consider whether in this bill or in the subsequent Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill that we expect later this year to expand the applicability of the sanctions regime. So, for example, breaches of Section 34 of the Residential Tenancies Act in terms of notices to quit. I think that would be eminently sensible for this sanction regime to apply to those. I think all rent reviews should be applicable. Why is it that tenants in rent pressure zones will get this added protection, but tenants outside rent pressure zones, particularly in areas whether it's Limerick or Waterford or Sligo Town that are seeing very, very significant increases, won't get any protections from this at all? To me, that doesn't make any sense, and I think that's something you could deal with by way of an amendment in this bill. Ultimately, and I don't think you can do it in this legislation, but ultimately, I think we are going to need some kind of sanction for serious breaches of minimum standards, serious breaches of overcrowding, in the same way as we currently have legislative provision for serious antisocial behaviour. And maybe that's something that the officials could look at for the subsequent piece of legislation, whereby on foot of an inspection by a local authority or an environmental health officer from the HSE providing a report to the Residential Tenancies Board for substantial breach of those regulations, sanctions could then be taken. One issue... Oh, absolutely, I move the adjournment.